My name is Francesco Duberli. I'm the Chief Executive Officer at Survivors Pathway Organization, and I'm the Chairman of the Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Council of Greater Miami, also known as DVSAC. In regards of Survivors Pathway, we're a justice center with the goal of assisting victims of crimes to achieve justice. In this case, we provide services to victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, sex trafficking, hate crimes, and any other type of violent crime. We have a very holistic approach in which we believe that in order for a person to understand and achieve justice, also include the process of healing and to navigate in the system, especially for those that are immigrants or individuals from marginalized communities. The idea of justice is not that common, that easy to understand, and even very complicated to navigate. So what Survivors Pathway does is to put in place and to provide a group of professionals, mental health counselors, social workers, advocates, people in the healthcare, to assist the victim to navigate this very complex process we call the justice system, with the goal to achieve justice and therefore to heal from the victimization that person has experienced. Let's say that every time that if the government or whoever it is that remove $1, a penny out of the budget to assist victims, then it's basically putting a big wall for that person to achieve justice. We perhaps need to re-evaluate what we call justice and to understand better the social issues that take place in our country and the complexities of it, right? Like being ignorant about the complexities in the structures, right? The dynamics that take place within the process of victimization can be going to the detrimental of the victim. And in the case you're talking about, it's even much more complex because sex trafficking is it is a crime that is so ingrained in many of the failures that we as society have, and then we need to be accountable as members of this country, as citizens of this country, in regards of how is that the way that we have currently our society have placed specific members of our communities in such a level of danger, and at the end made them so vulnerable to being victimized, right? So there's this huge misunderstanding between sex trafficking and prostitution, right? And there's always been a discussion about it, right? Some people think that sex trafficking is not sex trafficking, it's just sex work or prostitution, and therefore should not be considered a victim, right, of the process of victimization. But we need to understand that the person that is a victim of sex trafficking is an individual that has been forced to engage in this type of activities, that in any ways there's a context of exploitation and fraud and coercion, right? It's not out of free will. And we also need to understand that most of those victims of sex trafficking are people that live in high levels of poverty, or they come from communities that are highly marginalized, right? And that makes it even more complex and delicate, because we know that many of members of individuals that has been victims of sex trafficking come from communities like the LGBT community, right? So we know that the transgender community especially those that are immigrants, are highly affected by sex trafficking, and not because they decide to engage in these activities, but because the fact that they experience other type of discriminations, like job discrimination, right? They don't have our same privilege to access the job force as we do, and on the contrary, they experience very strong barriers in terms of accessing the job force. And then by not having access to that system, then they've been forced to do what we call survival sex. And within the context of survival sex, then they become very vulnerable to sex trafficking, to be sexually exploited. The same happened, for instance, to children that identify as gay or queer or bisexual, that just because their sexual orientation, they're kicked out of home and exposed to high levels of violence within the context of the family, and then they have to escape, run away. And then, for instance, all of us know that Miami is a big place for tourism, right? But tourism alone bring with it the sex industry. So we know that many of those kids kind of run away from home and drive all the way down to Miami. And Miami is the perfect place to encounter an environment that is not the best, right? That make them very vulnerable to being sexually exploited. So also we need to talk about poverty, right? Poverty in America is not well discussed. It's a topic that is kind of not very welcome. But we have communities of color, most of them of immigrants, that experience high levels of poverty. And poverty make the person also very vulnerable to be exposed to crimes like this. So having a radical perception that we should not add money, or that we should criminalize those that are doing an activity for what they have been forced to do, that they haven't, that they're not willing to do, but then it's not an activity of their choice, but instead, right, they're being forced, exploited. So it's a big mistake, because basically we make those communities more vulnerable. We re-victimizing them, and the criminalization of the individuals that are doing these activities is terribly wrong, because it's basically tell to a specific population that has been very marginalized and historically oppressed, that there's not justice. And therefore, by doing that, we're going against our principles as country. And then we might then question that concept of justice for all, because then justice is not for all. Or how we then define justice for all when there's other beliefs that get into the process of allowing people to achieve justice, especially those that are in specific activities. So it becomes very complex, perhaps the discussion of this, but from my perspective, I think it's a bad decision, and the consequences are catastrophic to many people in this country, and unfortunately for those that are very invisible and very living at the margins of our society. As I was saying before, the issue of invisibility is a complex matter, right? Because as I was saying before, it removes the dignity and it humanizes people. And then the answer would be that we need at least start making communities that are invisible visible, and that goes to the concept of inclusion, right? We need to bring those that we have placed in the margins of our society, and then bring them back to our mainstream society. Every movement is a good movement, right? because it brings back in a big scale the light to any issue. Domestic violence is a big issue that I do believe, as a person that have devoted years of my life working with victims, that is still very invisible, right? The numbers are scary. The impact that has in our society is devastating. But by any reason, we're still not yet there in that moment of understanding and having clear facts, right? What is the cost of the death of a person in domestic violence? And in this case, I'm just gonna give an example. To a woman. The person, the male that killed that woman, that has 2-3 children, is not only killing a person in destroying a life, it's destroying the life of a whole family and the whole community, and that has an effect in the whole society. So we should then reflect about what is the cost, right? The cost in society, in finances, the emotional cost. So the Me Too movement is great because it brought, right, the light to a very big issue. I guess we need still to continue strengthening and talking about other complex matters related with domestic violence, like for instance, that domestic violence also happens to males, right? That is not a matter of women also, because I guess I have the feeling that in some moment the Me Too movement kind of only made a great work and putting the light and spot on violence against women, but there's violence against male in the context of domestic violence. So and we need to talk about domestic violence and same-sex couples and many other ways of experiencing domestic violence, but definitely the lethality of domestic violence is something that we don't talk that much. And we have communities like Miami-Dade County that has a huge impact on lethality. So we cannot continue allowing our families being destroyed by the consequences of domestic violence, right? That's when we say no more deaths. So yes, Me Too was great. And I hope that other movements continue growing and doing that work of bringing back to all of us, to all the community, the realities of those that perhaps were not here that much.